I feel the war is at this really important juncture. President Trump is trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by military means, through threats against Iranian power plants, and to seek to end the war through diplomatic talks. I think what people are struggling with, what I'm struggling with, is a full understanding of who has the upper hand right now, who is in a stronger position as that process unfolds.
Iran. I think, and I regret having come to this conclusion because, like many MI6 officers of my generation, we've faced the violence and brutality of the IRGC for most of our careers.
That's the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps.
Yeah, so there is no love lost between us. And I shed no tears for Ali Khamenei, who was killed at the beginning of this war. But the reality is that the US underestimated the task and I think, as of about 2 weeks ago, lost the initiative to Iran. In practice, the Iranian regime has been more resilient than I think anyone would have expected. They took some good decisions, actually, as early as last June about dispersing their military capability and delegating the authority for the use of those weapons, which has given them significant extra resilience against this incredibly powerful air campaign. They have embarked on what's technically called horizontal escalation, i.e. firing rockets at anybody within range, which at the time, honestly, Shashank, I thought was nuts, but in fact has been a very good way of putting in direct price on the US. Sort of worked. And then they've understood the significance of the energy war and held the straits at threat and globalized and essentially not internationalized, just globalized the conflict in a way that gives them some weapons. So they've played a weak hand pretty well. And at the same time, my second point is that Donald Trump has said some stuff that will have confirmed something they knew already, which is that they're in a civilizational war in their terms. They're in a war of existence. Donald Trump made it very clear that he wanted to see them, up against the wall, basically. Whereas America has embarked on a war of choice, and in those terms, I think that's imbued them with more staying power than their US and certainly US counterparts. And they know that now. And I think that really is giving them the whip hand. And then finally, there's a very technical point, which you'll be as expert or more expert on than I am, which is about stocks of drones and the reality, as I understand it, that whilst this has been an almost perfectly executed military campaign from the air, you can't reduce the threat to zero. And while you can't reduce the threat to zero, Iran can hold the straits at threat. Even with just 10% of its initial drone stocks, it can hold the straits at threat because these are not military people. It's not a military audience you have to satisfy. This is people who own oil tankers and captains of oil tankers. And that really does give them the whip hand. So I think the options for the US and Israel are pretty limited and not great.
That really brings us to the question of the regime, which is in place, weakened, but still the Islamic Republic stands as a revolutionary entity, the Revolutionary Guard, the organization that planted roadside bombs that killed many of your colleagues over those years. That stands and is surviving. So to start with, have they been more resilient than you thought? How do you understand their survival and their endurance now?
I think that they are in the death throes. And but I think the irony is that the biggest threat to them is peace, not war. The January uprising showed that they have no answers. Yeah. The hatred that engendered is endemic and will last for decades. The estimates are up to 10,000 of their own citizens machine gunned in the street by IRGC-sponsored militias. I don't expect them to survive into the long term as a result. But of course, ironically, this situation is an environment where they get an extra lease of life because it's hard for opposition to organise in the face of an air campaign, and they're licensed to be even more brutal than they were before. I think when it comes to the nuclear stuff, the very large majority of Iran, perhaps 80% of them, are against. In fact, they've had it with the theocratic regime, and that actually was sort of how the voting went when Masoud Pezeshkian was elected. So this is data from
president of Iran,
and it wasn't a manipulated election. It showed that pretty well 80% of Iran wants nothing more to do with this sort of total resistance theocratic ideology. But the 20%, or probably even less, 10%, are the ones with the guns. And that is proving decisive. They are empowered by this situation to continue to brutalise the population.
You've got this interesting attrition that's taken place at the top of the regime and new faces coming through. Some of them, though, probably quite well known to you. The new IRGC chief, General Vahidi, he's a former Quds Force commander. The Quds Force was, of course, very active in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you would have seen them up close. You've got, of course, Ali Larijani killed last week in an airstrike, but people like Saeed Jalili and other figures who were long, at the top of this regime, still there. Many of the people you'd have been studying closely as SIS chief, I'm sure, have died in the last 2 weeks. There's been huge turnover. What do you make of the kind of ideological complexion of the regime as it has changed in these last 4 weeks?
I think the net effect, which was probably going to happen anyway, is that that we've seen the end of the theocracy. Actually, with the end of Ali Khamenei, his successor was never going to be as powerful as he was. That's kind of it. And in Mujtaba, although he's ostensibly a cleric, he doesn't have his father's credentials. You basically see an IRGC takeover. Not a dictatorship so much as a junta, I would say. And that's how Iran is being run now. So, in paraphrase, the beards have got shorter.
Tell me a bit more about the IRGC, because they're the regime's revolutionary guard. They're the in a way a bit like the PLA. They're the armed force that guards the revolution, not the state. That's the regular army, which is disempowered, not very influential. But how religious is it? How ideological are they? Because they also have big business interests, don't they? They're corrupt. They're sort of smuggling things across borders. What are these? Who are these people?
Yeah, they're no less ruthless than Ali Khamenei, but they are more corrupt and significant beneficiaries of the sanctions regime. So they're sort of invested in this black economy that's being created by the long-standing sanctions, which is one of the reasons why you might think they would be more pragmatic in these circumstances. It's important to understand Mujtaba as just a sort of, we've never even seen him. He's just a figurehead to all of this. So these guys are in charge. None of them, as you say, have any sort of track record that might imply leanings toward reform, but they are, I think, more pragmatic. That's certainly true.
You say the regime is in its death throes. Now, that process, it can be terminal, but that process could last a long time for Iran. What follows? You're not a mind reader, but what are the prospects you would put on a democratic transition versus some other kind of rather messy and unpleasant transition?
Yeah. I actually think in some ways this war, as I've said, may sustain their capacity to brutalize the regime. But I particularly think after what happened in January, the chances of them keeping the show on the road indefinitely are low. Look, what comes next, who knows? All I can counsel is just sort of listen to the dialogue, in particular any sort of buyer's remorse around the Mujtaba appointments when they could have put in someone like Ayatollah Khomeini's son, who is a much more pragmatic person but has real religious credentials. That would have been another way to go. That, in fact, would have augured some kind of shift. Masoud Pezeshkian, listen to him, fundamentally a secular reformist figure, but clearly really under the thumb of the IRGC at the moment. If he starts speaking more freely, then you have the prospect of the 80% of Iran that is actually just sort of had enough of this starting to prevail, not just demographically, but electorally. Maybe that would be a clue that I would be listening to.